Welcome to Bytedance podcast. As of now, more than 5,000 professionals and thought leaders subscribe to our newsletter. Many of you have deep domain knowledge as well as your own questions and answers about China-related topics. From time to time, we will interview our subscribers like you to share with us your thoughts about China and the world. Today, we are pleased to have a longtime subscriber of us, Han. Han is a Singaporean lawyer with over 15 years of experience specializing in technology and IP law. Currently based in Singapore, Han has extensive experience working with Chinese tech companies. Most recently, Han served as principal legal counsel at NetEase Games, 网易游戏, where he provided legal support for their international expansion outside of China. Prior to that, he was the head of legal for Southeast Asia, Australia, and New Zealand at Bytedance, where he built and managed a team of 36 lawyers to scale up legal support across Bytedance's business activities in the region. In our conversations today, Han will share his first-hand thoughts and experience on what are the challenges and opportunities about Chinese companies expanding overseas, which is one of China's most important structural trends we will all be watching in the decade to come. Han, I understand that you've been working with a number of Chinese companies in Singapore, in APAC, in Southeast Asia. So among all these companies that you work with, what do you think are the main challenges right now for these Chinese businesses? Because we all know it's a new trend for big Chinese conglomerates, companies, even startups going abroad, expanding overseas. What do you think are the main challenges for them?
I think for a lot of Chinese companies, they have an understanding. So I think they're not coming into the market without awareness. I think they have the awareness that they need to adapt to local market conditions. So I think that's a very good starting point. I think the tricky part is how to do it, because having that awareness is a very good starting point. But I think each individual market will have its own nuances. So if, for example, like you don't have experience operating a business outside of China and you're used to operating a business in China, then you're used to what you can perceive as like a single market, right? Because China is a single market. I mean, granted, there may be regional variations in different cities or provinces, but then once you step out, you're dealing with entirely different countries. So for example, in Southeast Asia, you have like 11, 12, 13 countries. So you end up having to take a fragmented approach to each country. And not all businesses have the resources to do that kind of fine-tuned adjustment, right? You may, for example, if you're a startup versus a conglomerate, like if you're a big conglomerate, you probably have the resources to do the kind of fine-grained adjustment for each country. But if you're a startup, you might not. So you may have to end up prioritizing, for example, like the biggest markets first, and then the smaller markets later on, for example. Right? So that's one approach, depending on what resources are available to you. I mean, the other, building on top of that, so even if you have that awareness, then there's also different approaches of how to adapt to local conditions. Like, for example, some people might say bring in their trusted talent from China into the local market. So that's one approach that some companies have taken. Another approach is they then hire locals who they can trust. So then they will need to go through a process of selecting and hiring trusted locals that they can work with, right? So there's pros and cons to each approach, because if you so-called drop in someone who is from your existing team, then of course the trust factor is already there. But then the question then is, can that person adapt quickly enough to that local market condition, for example? And the other approach would be, you hire a local, then you need to ensure that your process is rigorous enough to really select someone that you can trust and who is capable, right? So that process can be challenging because, frankly speaking, in some markets, the talent is very few. So you end up fighting for only a handful of people. And that's where you see a lot of people poaching each other's people, right? Like, big company A from China actually poaching big company B from people who then that big company B is also from China, right? So people end up fighting for a few talent because they know they can trust that talent and they know that person has that local expertise, but there's not that many of them, right? I think
Right.
some companies actually have a third approach, which I think is quite smart, right? Which would be like maybe they find talent who is maybe culturally attuned to Chinese companies. So maybe either
Mm.
a Chinese national who have lived and worked overseas for many years. That's one possibility,
Hmm.
or
Hmm.
someone who actually could be ethnically Chinese but not from China, but understands Chinese culture and understands how to work with Chinese companies, and therefore they can more easily integrate with the company, but have also the local market knowledge to help drive the company within that region. So that's another approach. But again, as I mentioned earlier, such people are not everywhere. It's not so easy to find so many of such people.
Right. So it seems like to me, you mentioned the third strategy of hiring, which is this more culturally integrated, culturally more nuanced choice. I guess that should be the mainstream right now, right? If you look at, say, Zhou Shouzhi, when I talk about this option, I think of
Yes.
him. He's Singaporean, who is ethnically Chinese, who can speak Chinese, who has some job experience in Greater China region, but now he was the CEO of this US based
Yeah.
TikTok, right? So is that what you have in mind when you
Yeah.
talk about that
Yeah,
kind of
he's a
option? Yeah.
perfect example. I'd say he's probably like the elite example because his credentials are,
Mm,
very top tier, right? Like he went to Harvard MBA, he has all the right connections to studying in the US. Harvard MBA is basically where you meet other, people of the same caliber, right? So, and then of course after that he went to
mm,
DST, and then after DST it was Xiaomi. So he pretty much has the capability, the cultural understanding, and the right connections with people. So he's the top tier example. But again, such talents are not everywhere, so they're quite hard to find. So you could find other examples that I wouldn't say not top tier, but other examples where it's a little more understated, but they still exist. So you may have heard of this company called Shopee. It's actually the C Group.
mm,
The three founders are originally from China, but they became Singapore citizens and then they built their business in Singapore, right? So it's a Singapore-based company, but they do have a significant presence in China in terms of their hiring and their teams, right? And Shopee being an e-commerce company, a lot of the suppliers are in China as well. And what I
right.
understand is one of their founders who handles their e-commerce and payments business moved himself to Jakarta and lived there fully immersed in Indonesia because they know that Indonesia is the
Mm,
biggest market in Southeast Asia. So that kind of
mm,
commitment, it's amazing because he's from mainland China, so he became a Singapore citizen, and then he understands Singapore culture and Singapore and the Southeast Asian culture, but he takes it even further. He moved himself and his whole family to Indonesia, based himself in Jakarta, and immersed himself in the culture there. So that's the kind of cultural awareness and understanding that we're talking about. That you could be from mainland China doesn't mean you can't adapt. It just requires that kind of commitment. And he's not the only one. Like throughout the whole time I've worked in various Chinese companies, the amazing thing is I've met Chinese people from mainland China all over the world, and they've just immersed themselves in
mm,
local culture. And Southeast Asia is actually easy because it's so close to China, right? But I've met people from China who are like based in Africa, in the Middle East, and they've based themselves there for maybe 10, 15 years. And then they will also have that local knowledge because they've been living there for so long. But you also have the reverse, which is amazing to me because I still recall like one of the companies that I worked for during the first day orientation for their international team members, right? The first day I went there, I found that the orientation, I found that there were people from all over the world. And because I,
mm,
I am ethnically Chinese and I look Chinese, everyone thought I was from mainland China. But then, yeah, because they assume that you are, because everyone else there was not. So I still recall the amazing thing for me, the coolest thing was like I saw people who I could tell from the language they were speaking Arabic, and there are some who looked like they were from Africa, and they were speaking perfect Beijing Qiang Chinese. And and to me that was amazing because then I understand that is the talent hiring program of that company, that they know that they want to do business in these countries. They can also hire from international students in China, then they can use this talent to help them grow in overseas markets. So that's another recruitment strategy that they have. So then these operations managers then will help them grow in these countries, whether it's Middle East, Africa, even Latin America, because there are a lot of, international students studying in China that are perfect for this role.
I really love this example you mentioned about the co-founder of Shopee stationed in Jakarta. So you also mentioned the markets in Southeast Asia, in APAC, are quite fragmented. There are many different countries. And I know that you used to work for those companies as their internal counsel for the whole region. I just couldn't imagine how can you do counseling for all these jurisdictions at the same time for a Chinese company. Is there anything that you can share how exactly you manage to do that? What are the challenges, and how do you manage all these different laws, legal system at the same time?
So I think there's a lot of reading and a lot of research that needs to be done. But what's funny to me is that the company I was at for 4 years, when I joined, the official line is that there is no 996outside of China. But because of the work, I ended up having 996 anyway. So so the amount of time, but I have to say it is tiring. But then there is a trade-off in which I learned a lot immensely, right? So there's this saying that, at this company, if you work there for 1 year, it's equivalent to 3 years in other company. And I think to a certain extent, it's kind of true based on the learning that you get. So again, I was there for 4 years. So the first 2 years, I was by myself. So it was a very intense experience, but I really enjoyed it a lot. I learned a lot in terms of how a Chinese tech company works, and then also in terms of learning to be a counsel for the region as a sole counsel. The second half is when I was tasked to grow a team and to create a team. So I ended up having a team of about 36 lawyers by the time I left. And so the nature of the work changes, right? So certainly, like you said, there's multiple jurisdictions, there's a lot of work. So I had to not only just have my own internal research, but we also work with external lawyers in each market. So then I become obviously the advisor to the internal business. And my role is like not just lawyer. If you think about it, it's also like a project manager, right? I have to get all the different advice from each country, lawyers in each country. I have to integrate that advice and create usable advice that the business can use. Because the business doesn't want to deal with 10 different lawyers, right? To them, it's troublesome. Like that's my job. My job is to integrate the whole thing into something that's usable for them. So if you think about it as an in-house lawyer, you're not only just a lawyer, you're also a project manager, you're a client servicing to your internal clients. So I spend a lot of time also, ensuring that the business has advice that they can use, integrated, across the region. But of course, by the time I left, I have a team to do that already by time. Because then I have team members in each country. Yeah.
Right. So what do you think is the trickiest jurisdiction for Chinese companies in the APAC region that you cover? What do you think is the trickiest?
I actually think that they all have different challenges. But I would say, though, I think Southeast Asia is generally quite favorable to Chinese companies. There are some challenges here and there, but I think it's not insurmountable because if you think of it even historically, for maybe last 1,000 to 2,000 years, the Chinese civilization and various civilizations in Southeast Asia have always been in contact and working and with each other. So there's always this understanding that even if you have differences, even if there are challenges, you can work it through. It's about how you come to a solution that works for both sides. I think that's the difficult part because then you need to convince your internal stakeholders. So it depends on your internal stakeholders, right? Like you have to tell them, so your advice is, look, we want to make this business work. So for it to work, sometimes you
Mm-hmm.
have to compromise. Like you might not be able to get 100% of what you want, but if you can get like 70%, that's really good because you want to keep it going, right? So I think it's a bit cliche to say that even in Southeast Asia, it's also Asian culture, right? But I think there's a lot more similarity
Mm-hmm.
between Asian cultures of different regions, as opposed to like I had colleagues who cover like the Americas or the European markets, and I think it's way more challenging for them because, it's the difference between cultures is quite a bit wider than from China to Southeast Asia.
Right. You mentioned culture, and I understand apart from Chinese companies, you've also worked with Singaporean companies and maybe Western companies as well. What do you think is the key difference between a Chinese tech company and a Western tech company, a US tech company that people are more used to? Can you describe the environment within that may be different or maybe
Okay,
underappreciated?
I think I'll talk about what is in common first. Then I'll talk about differences. Because
Okay.
what's in common is very funny. What I notice is any company, regardless of where it's from, once it hits a certain size, right, when it's very big, then you see a lot of similarities, which is bureaucracy, politics, things become very slow. So I think that's common, regardless of where you're from, right? Whether it's Chinese, American, European. Once
Mm-hmm.
you get too big, it becomes very bureaucratic and slow. But at the
Mm-hmm.
startup stage, there are also a lot of similarities, right? Like people have a sense of mission, like let's get this done. You have objectives, let's get this done. Because at the initial stage, mission and objectives are quite simple and clear. Everyone knows what they have to do. It only becomes complicated when the company becomes very big because then you have a lot of people, and then sometimes you ask yourself, what are all these people doing? What are their roles? Sometimes people don't know, right? It's too big and complicated. But when you're small, it's very clear. Everyone has a mission and an objective. And I find that what's interesting to me, that what I know, this is a particular experience in this company that I was at when they're
Mm-hmm.
initially only working with colleagues from mainland China to versus at a later point in time working with colleagues who are outside of China and non-Chinese. That in Chinese companies, people are more direct and especially tech
Mm-hmm.
companies. I cannot generalize that to all Chinese companies because there is somehow
Mm-hmm.
this assumption that, oh, Chinese people are not direct. But I don't think that's true of tech companies. Tech companies are very direct in that they say, okay, this is working, great. This is not working, this is bad. Of course, there are different levels. I've heard, not the one I was at, I've heard from other people, friends working in other companies, that it can get quite unpleasant because they will say, this is terrible. You are
Mm-hmm.
horrible. You do a terrible job and you are a terrible person, right? So I think that's unnecessary, but sometimes it happens, right? But at the very least, if it's a good non-toxic environment, they will be very direct and say, this is not good. Please change it. Or they might say, "Look, you could do better. This is not the expectation. Please do better." Whereas I think my perception, also not direct, but from friends who are working in the big US tech companies, there is a lot of resistance to saying things directly. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of,
Right.
being careful around people's feelings and not willing to say things so directly. So I think, that's one big difference I noticed. So I think at least
Mm-hmm.
in Chinese tech companies, they prioritize the mission and the focus on what needs to be done. Whereas,
Right.
in at least in US tech companies, what I've understood is that there's a lot of, tiptoeing around people's feelings.
I can totally relate to that, I think. I totally see what you mean. Although it sounds counterintuitive, where in the Asian society, everyone's supposed to be
Exactly,
reserved, to
yes.
be respect. Yeah, and I can totally see what you mean. At least for the tech companies or for the within any company, I
Mm,
think. If I want to
mm,
add, it's actually much easier for colleagues and for peers to comment directly on each other. Maybe not so much about state-owned enterprises or
mm,
governments. But for more private businesses, it's definitely quite direct. And there's really not much concern about, as you said, stepping on someone's toes. So, any other differences that you find interesting?
I don't have the data to support this, so this is just an opinion. I think Chinese companies are actually more self-aware about adapting to local requirements, right? Because
How
yeah,
so?
this is an interesting observation, right? Because this is also slightly ironic, I have to say, right? Like if you think about Western companies are perceived as, they care a lot about diversity, they care a lot about, being inclusive, but you find that in general, like when they open like an office in a place, they bring their culture with them. And they'll say, everyone just does this same thing as we do it back in HQ. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So their conception of diversity, quote unquote, is very narrow, limited to their own version of what
Mm-hmm.
diversity means, right? And I think
Mm-hmm.
maybe 4 or 5 years ago, if a Chinese company was growing outside of China, they would probably have done the same. They would probably have said, yeah, well, this is how we do things in China. We should do the same here. But because of the big environment in terms of like geopolitics and perception that, oh, Chinese companies or Chinese people always want to do things their way, then I think the twist is that there's a lot more cultural awareness, that they are more careful. They're less likely to just say, this is how we do it in China, therefore you should always do it the same way here. They're less likely to do that because then they're more cautious. They're thinking, okay, we want our business to succeed. We don't want to offend people or to get shut down. So we want to be more careful in how we adapt to local circumstances. And I think sometimes it's actually backfire because they do too much, right? Like they're too
Really?
conscious of, trying to be adapting to local nuances that it becomes complicated for them. I mean, I can give you an example.
Oh
Not
yeah.
in my region. Let's use the US as an example. So
Mm-hmm.
everyone knows about TikTok and how it's doing in the US, right? And and I know that they make a very conscious effort to Americanize themselves in the US, right? But then that's where it
Mm-hmm.
becomes a problem because, like, if you have any understanding of American society, they are very polarized, right? They have people who are very ideologically opposite. And then if you try to adapt to local conditions, then the question is, what do you adapt to? And that's when you have a problem because if you want to be seen as inclusive, and then you adopt a lot of programs to show that, oh, I'm very inclusive, I include all these different voices, and I do all these programs, great, that's fantastic, right? But then you're just now opening yourself up to accusations by the opposite side locally to say, oh, you're
Mm-hmm.
driving an ideological
Mm-hmm.
agenda. But actually, that's never the intention. The intention is you're just there to do
Right.
business. You're just there to like show that you are local. But then by trying to do that, you end up
Mm-hmm.
being accused of doing something that you're not. So I think that's to me the biggest example
Mm-hmm.
of when you try to adapt to local market conditions, it is a minefield
Mm-hmm.
because if the local market conditions and the local culture is very polarized, then you end up being seen as taking sides. And then
Right.
if you
That.
try to please everyone, you end up pleasing no one because then everyone will accuse you of doing something. Oh, you're supporting the other side. But actually, you're not. You're just trying to do business and you're just trying to show that you're adapting to local market conditions. So I think this is a very, good example of what I'm talking about.
Yeah, the polarization in the U.S. is really complicated, and you add up the Chinese part of that, and you add up the internal societies conflict that I can totally imagine the explosive
Yes.
effect of that combo. In Southeast Asia, is there any equivalent to that, or it's more kind of
I think
subtle?
it's a lot more subtle, thank goodness. I think because again, I think it also matters that Southeast Asia has been neighbors with China for what thousands of years, right? So there is, and
Mm-hmm.
again, I think there is something to be said that Asian culture is a lot more subtle and nuanced at dealing with such things. Like you don't see the kind of
Mm-hmm.
polarization in Western societies that you do here, in Southeast Asia or in APAC in general. Like there's very few instances of such polarization. It tends to be even if people have differences of opinion, or differences in ideas, it tends to be resolved peacefully, and or through dialogue or through discussion or compromise, right? I think there are unfortunate instances here and there in certain places, but by and large, it's not like that, right? There's very few instances where there's moves towards anything so polarized in Southeast Asia.
Right. So here's my big question for you. You mentioned about perception of Chinese businesses abroad. And we all know that right now one of the biggest issues is the problem of TikTok in the US, right? And there is such a political movement to try to characterize TikTok as this vehicle of political agenda, this CCP Trojan horse, right? To get to the American people, and there's ongoing very substantial risk of either it's divesting from Bytedance Group or being shut down, right? So my question is, from your standpoint, the first question is, do you think this kind of criticism is fair, or how do you look at these? And second, what will be your advice to companies like TikTok who went to overseas market, who became big, but sooner or later face this kind of political backlash? That's my question.
Okay, I think I'll first say upfront though that I think I'm quite biased in the sense that obviously I'm a big fan of Chinese companies and Chinese products because contrary to perception, like they are very high quality and very good. I mean, of course, you have a huge range. There are people who are, not good businesses, but there are a lot of excellent businesses with excellent products, right? So my views are slightly biased, I have to say. But yeah, I think the overall environment is that it depends on what kind of products or service that you have. So, okay, I think as a starting point, I have to say adapting to local markets in terms of culture is good business practice, but it shouldn't be done in a way that loses the Chineseness of the products. And that's the reason why I say that, right? And keeping in mind, this is talking about culture, so not regulations. If you're talking about regulations from a legal perspective, because I am a lawyer, you have to comply. You don't have a choice. The law is the law. So that's one thing, right? But we're talking about other things like culture, marketing, branding. I think it's important to maintain the Chineseness of the product. I can give a few examples actually. So depending on the product, right? So if it's, say, a car or beauty lifestyle or food, right? So let's talk about cars first, right? I think when people buy a car, they don't really care where it comes from. They care that it's safe, it's usable, and it gets you from point A to point B, right? That's the basic requirement. Then on top of that, you can build other things. For example, like maybe it projects a certain kind of lifestyle. Does it project that you are rich and wealthy? Or does it project that you are a very practical person? Or does it project that you are a very smart person? It depends, right? So the product you buy kind of signifies who you are. So if it's a car, I'd say it's a neutral thing. You could just pretend that it's not Chinese, for example. But then the question you ask yourself is, like, does Toyota pretend that it's not Japanese? Or does Volkswagen pretend that it's not German? So I don't see a reason why a car should pretend that it's not from China, right? I think the key then is to ask yourself, what makes Toyota Japanese? And what part of that makes it appealing to people? What makes Volkswagen German? And what makes it appealing to people? Then that question goes back to what makes a Chinese-made car Chinese and what makes that appealing to people. So I think that the key thing is to find out and to ask yourself and really find out what makes it appealing to people and then retain that, right? Don't lose, the Chineseness of that product, right? So that's a car, for example, right? So next, let's talk about like food or beverage, right? Like previously we talked about before, like rojamo as a food product, right? And this is very interesting to me because I love eating. So I had this discussion again. It's not scientific. It's not like mass data reviewed, but it's based on his opinion. So I have this friend. He's an American from Texas, based in Singapore. He's a good friend. He's also a founder, in a tech company. He does robotics, which is amazing. And I went with him to eat rojamo and he loves it, right? And he says, like, I could take
Mm,
this to the US and I can imagine people will line up to eat it. But we talked about where, right? So this is the part where it's interesting. He's saying, right, look, if you're going to sell this in California, you definitely play up the Chinese angle because people will be like, firstly, there's a big Asian population in California, so they want authentic Chinese food. And secondly,
mm,
to non-white people, they'll be like, oh, this is so exotic because it's from China, right? So they like
mhm,
it because it's Chinese. It's a bit like boba tea, right? Papa cha, right? So they know that it's originating from China and they like it for that reason. But he also said, if I were to bring this to like, I don't know, some rural town in Texas where he's from, then I would still sell the same thing, but I would remove the spicy noodles. But I'll just have the rojamo and I'll call it crispy burger, right? So then the branding changes, right? So now it's you
I
don't emphasize
see.
the Chineseness anymore, but you still sell the same product. You just call it crispy burger, right? No spicy noodles, none of the very
Mm,
uniquely Chinese things, but you could still sell the same product. So that's another example, right? Food. And the last example I want to talk about actually is Florasis. Is a makeup brand. It's like 花西子, right? So like, yeah.
spicy.
So I spend a
Yeah.
lot of time on social
Mhm,
media, like as part of my research. Again, non-scientific, very anecdotal. But you find that, like, for example, if you go on TikTok and you find that so many Western influencers using Florasis products and they love it for its Chinese style and branding. That's
mm,
where, to me, it's a very clear example of you cannot lose the Chineseness of the product because that is the unique selling point, right? Because if you lose the
mm,
Chineseness of the product, then why buy Florasis? You could just buy, I don't know, Sephora, Chanel, or whatever, right? Some other product. But people want to buy Florasis because it's Chinese and because the style is Chinese. In fact, it's so distinctive. You will find that if you go on TikTok, you will find that there's literally even a hashtag called Douyin makeup, like which is literally a style.
mhm,
So there are people who go on Douyin, find the Douyin makeup tutorials, and then copy it onto TikTok. And then all these ladies who are non-Chinese and they see it and they think, wow, I love this style and I want to do this. So they buy Chinese makeup and they adopt Douyin style makeup and they like the product for its Chinese origin. So to me, this will be an example of a product that must retain its Chinese characteristics because that is the unique selling point. So the purpose of various examples is, I guess, a long way of saying it really depends on the product or service. You know,
mm.
it requires analysis to think about like what product you have, what's the positioning in the market, who are you selling to, and then you think about, you know, how much of the Chinese, you know, uniqueness to retain. But I still think fundamentally, you know, you have to retain at least some of the unique Chinese characteristics.
Yeah, that's very interesting examples that you are sharing, because I think the story of TikTok makes a lot of Chinese companies afraid about being Chinese. I think that's one significance of the imagery of this whole Congress hearings and this whole new media coverage. It does make a lot of Chinese people and Chinese companies afraid. And then I personally know some Chinese startups who basically just leave China and totally reinvent themselves as, say, American companies or some other foreign
Mm,
companies. I think most of the companies right now are still at the stage of, don't call me a Chinese company, call me whatever, a Singaporean, American. But I think what you're saying, it also makes total sense. And I guess it will take some time for more Chinese companies to realize they actually can leverage the fact that they're
yeah.
Chinese. So we talk about the Americans' perception of Chinese companies, but what about your region, the Southeast Asia, the APAC? What are people talking and thinking about the Chinese companies, and which part of the so-called Chineseness that you think that could be highlighted to help businesses be more successful?
Yeah, I think one thing to emphasize in this part of the world, the culture is such that people don't have to like each other to work together. I think people are understanding of that. And we're not just talking about ordinary people on the ground. I think even the governments here, there's that approach. Like there's always room to work together regardless of differences. So I think generally in Southeast Asia, for example, you see, I think in a recent update that you posted, and which also referenced like a survey conducted in Singapore of various segments of population in Southeast Asia and their perception of China. And then there's varying levels of like preference and trust. But I think you'll find in general that even countries which have low trust of China will still be very happy to work with Chinese companies. I think that is the mature
Mm,
perception, right? The mature way of thinking, which is I don't have to like you, I can still work with you because it's just business, right? So, various countries across SEA, like, whether it's Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, right? Different countries may have varying levels of disagreements with China, but you'll find that Chinese businesses there
mhm,
will do business perfectly fine. You just work within
mm,
local cultural norms, work with local regulations, and then you'll be fine. You just be operating normally. There's no specific targeted, attacks against Chinese businesses. That like it doesn't work that way, at least in Southeast
mm.
Asia.
So what about the strengths though? I mean, you talk about leveraging part of the fact of being Chinese as a strength in businesses. So is there any part of this Chineseness that you find could be appealing even to some of the markets that in your region? Also, maybe for different type of businesses, is there anything you can
Yeah,
share?
I think the appeal will primarily not be cultural but technical. So I think at least in the region,
Mm,
people have seen how, the success of China in, raising the standards of living of its people, right? So, they see that
mm,
this is a path of development that they can adopt. So they want to do the same. And
mm,
naturally, their perception would be, okay, let me learn from you. I want to adopt your know-how, your technical skills. And that's where the business collaboration comes in, right? If you want to do business in this country, then, what is your contribution to this country? What can you do to help us, right? Overall. So I think that's one thing.
right.
For example, we talk about like government relations for Chinese businesses that want to operate in Southeast Asia. It's very much you cannot be seen to just come here and make money, right? You need to be seen as
Mm,
doing more than just that, right? Sure, you can operate here, you can make money, but how do you help the people here, right? Are you supporting local small businesses? Are you helping to develop a local industry? Are you helping to grow, like, say, more STEM graduates in the local country? Contribute to like internships, for example, hiring more local graduates and training them. There's a lot of this, which is very pragmatic. It's non-ideological. It's very development focused. So I think this is where it's works very well with the Chinese way because it's very pragmatic. And
right.
and also it's the Chinese experience of, raising the standards of living of people that then other countries want to do the same. So there's that contribution that, these Chinese companies can make.
Right. So you mentioned that people can do business without liking each other. And so my question will be, what part of China, what part of being Chineseness that people in Southeast Asia don't like, that the Chinese companies they should be more
Yeah.
careful about?
Okay. Yeah, I think okay,
Yeah.
there's the business side and there's like the cultural side. I think the business side is that something I referenced to earlier. If people have the attitude that like, oh yeah, this is how we always do it in China, so you must do the same. I think generally local employees will find it very hard to work with, because I understand the concept of processes. Like, in China, most companies have certain processes. I think a very famous one would be most companies have this thing called OA, right? So you all have internal
Mm-hmm.
OA, and when a non-Chinese person joins a Chinese company and then they first learn about this OA, they are very shocked because they'll be very confused how to work with this OA because they've never encountered it before, right? So I think that
Mm-hmm.
for Chinese companies that want to grow outside of China, they need to be aware of how do you adapt your OA for processes outside of China that will be different. So that's I
Mm.
think one very big, business oriented process that needs to be have some awareness of. I think on the cultural side, there's also, I think it's not all Chinese, but it's more maybe certain from certain parts of China who, like, if, for example, the local culture is more reserved and quiet, but then if like the Chinese person is from a part of China that people are very loud, then there's a clash, right? There's a clash. So I think it requires a
Right.
certain level of awareness to know that, yeah, sure, maybe your local region, it's okay to be very loud or very direct. But then if the local culture in this part
Mm,
of the world is more reserved and quiet, then you kind of have to adjust a bit, right? So there's that kind
right.
of cultural awareness that needs to be built.
Right. Sure. So my last question is, say I'm a just imagine I'm a Chinese company. I have a sizable operation in China and I'm looking overseas. And I'm looking at Southeast Asia as my first venture into the overseas market. I want to be based there. I want to have a team there. I want to have a strong presence there. As you said, not just making money, but also contribute locally and have a sustainable presence. What will be your top advice for them to avoid making mistakes?
Mm. I think the key thing is you need to work out like the financial resources first because it's a
Mm,
gradual setup. It requires building up a team gradually, but then you need to budget ahead of time
mm,
because it sounds very boring, right? It's not glamorous or fancy, but it's
mm,
very practical, right? You need to
mm,
work out your resourcing because like in the region, I can give you like a rough overview. A lot of Chinese companies like to use Singapore as a HQ, but it's
mm,
very high cost, right? So it's great for a back office or a corporate office. But because the market is so small, you're not going to get any profits from this. So it's going to be a cost center effectively. But then it's also where it's best suited for putting legal functions, finance functions, all this, right? But then your main markets will be the biggest countries, right? Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia as well. So then these will be the local markets where you need to put people to do operations, sales. So as you can imagine, then when you start thinking about this whole structure, it's not small. It's quite involved. So then when you think about headcounts, where to put what function, the cost will start rising. So the
mm.
key is you can't do everything all at once. You need to think about stages, but then you still need to prepare the resources ahead of time to ensure that it can be a smooth build up of your team in Southeast Asia.
So, thanks for the conversation today. And for anyone in our audience who are interested in keeping in touch with Han and getting his advice for expansion and business strategies and legal advice in Southeast Asia, please you can find him through us. Thank you so much,
Thank
Han,
you.
for
Thanks for
joining
having me,
us
Robert.
today.